Termination management is another fiddly little topic. It's not that big, but it just can be a little bit complicated what we're actually being asked. So things we might get asked are describe, explain, outline both voluntary and involuntary termination. Describe, explain, or outline the termination management options or strategies for a business. Describe and explain or outline the employee entitlement and employee transition issues for a business. And maybe, unlikely, but maybe discuss, evaluate, or analyze the advantages and disadvantages of a voluntary and involuntary termination. So let's simplify it and say termination is basically the end of the employment relationship between the employee and employer. It can be voluntary when the employee decides to end it, and involuntary when the employer decides to end it. And we've got four sort of forms of termination. We've got voluntary, and under that we've got resignation and retirement. So that's where the employee decides. And involuntary, so these are where the employer decides. We've got retrenchment or redundancy and dismissal. So let's just go through each one. Resignation, the employer decides to leave the workplace, usually to go to another job. Why? Maybe there's poor morale and motivation, greater money elsewhere, or maybe better workplace conditions somewhere else. Retirement, this is a little bit different. The employee is leaving, but they decide to leave the paid for workforce forever. They're not going somewhere else to get a job, they're just leaving the workforce forever. Causes are obviously someone reaches retirement age, but it could also be employee morale. Maybe someone retired earlier than they planned because there's no motivation at work. Good things and bad things about this. Positives, you get opportunity for internal replacement. We can motivate remaining employees by promoting them. And also we can hire the best person. Maybe the best person, isn't the person that has the job now and they've left. We can now find the best person. Negatives, we lose talent and knowledge, especially with retirement. It's usually people that have been there a long time. Got a cost to replace them, recruitment fees, loss of productivity, etc. And a decline in morale. If everyone's leaving, it makes the people who stay behind feel bad. Then we've got involuntary termination, so retrenchment or redundancy. When an employee is terminated because their job is redundant, what that means is that the employee is no longer required by the business. So, for example, at the supermarket, there's not as many cash register operators as there used to be. Not their fault. We just got more self-checkout. Their job is redundant or they've been retrenched. So that's one obvious cause is technology. Economic or competitive conditions coming, resulting in cost cutting. Business is relocating, so maybe the job itself isn't redundant, but it's redundant in, say, Victoria, because we're moving it to Queensland, for example. And maybe the business is bought or acquired by another business who already does that job itself and gets rid of those jobs at the workplace. Dismissal, so when an employee is terminated due to incompetence or discipline because of their bad work performance, maybe they breach business policies like on social media or workplace safety, or even illegal behaviour, theft or bullying. So we just outright dismiss someone. So some pros and cons of involuntary termination. Well, involuntary, because it's the business deciding to end it, we're probably going to be more productive because we're not going to get rid of people that we wanted to keep. And it improves the culture as well. Also, reduce costs from redundancies. Well, that means we're going to save some money too. And lastly, it sets standards for people about what's acceptable. If we dismiss someone for a certain behaviour, that tells everyone else what's acceptable and what's not. High cost though, we're going to replace people, obviously not for redundancies because that means we're not going to replace them, but for dismissals. Decline morale, particularly with dismissals, they never go well and they leave other people upset. And we get an increased workload for remaining employees. So just to look at that, a couple of last little things, we've got to make sure we don't have unfair dismissal. So when an employee is dismissed in a harsh, unjust or unreasonable manner, not related to their performance. So for example, about they're dismissed because of their personal issues, a temporary absence due to illness, etc., making a complaint against the business, or being a member or not being a member of a union. Two last little things, we've got to, when someone does leave, entitlement issues, we've got a period of notice we've got to give them, redundancy pay, if it's a redundancy, any pay owing, and also any accrued leave owing. And lastly, what about when someone is leaving the workplace, particularly retirees, transition services here or issues to consider, and people that have been made redundant, we've got to do outplacement services, help them find a new job. We've also got to help them transition into retirement gradually, and maybe provide retirement services for people who aren't going to work again, things about how does their superannuation and government benefits and so on, how do they work?